kind of get pulled around with it. You're going to be working up here, and that's really awkward. So relax. You know, deep breaths. Sit comfortably. I'm not leaned way over my pot here. I'm sitting back like this. I do have a few students who they do that, but mostly they get cured of that eventually. Have you been cured of that yet, Lily? No. But I'll make fun of you if you do that, so that will cure you. All right, so I'm going to squeeze a little ridge down here, and then I'm simply going to lift that ridge up the side of the pot with my hands touching and my elbows still braced. The one other thing, and this is a little hard to explain, but my fingers are going to be offset a little bit. Imagine that the wall of the pot is in between my fingers. The inside hand is going to be a little bit above my outside hand. And that makes sense if you think about it, because there's a bottom in here that I've left. I've left a ½ inch of clay. So if my hands are at the very, very bottom, this one is going to be above this one. It really helps to make your pots thin and tall if you do that. So you want to keep that little bit of offsetness until you get to the very, very top of the pot. And you'll see that I'll actually get a pretty extreme dent that I'm actually bringing up the side of the pot because of that offset thing. So first thing I'm going to do is squeeze a little, or put a little water on. Then I'm going to squeeze a ridge. You can see there's a ridge there, and there's a corresponding one in here. And then I'm just going to lift that ridge up the side of the pot. And I still have some wet clay coming off of my sponge, so we'll get that off of there. And then I'll do a better pull. There we go. It just comes off like that. So you're not really doing anything wrong if you do that. Also, every single time I do a pull, one of the last things I do is straighten up that top edge. If the top edge is really uneven, if it's doing this, you're actually going to want to trim it off, and I'll show you how to do this. That's going to happen to this in a second, so I'll show you how to do that. But if it's relatively even, the last thing I'll do is just sort of straighten it back up again. And what I'm trying to do, if I cut this in half right now, it would be a really thick pot, but it would be evenly thick. It would be about that thick at the bottom and about that thick at the top. What I don't want is a really thick bottom and a really, really thin top. So you need to ease up on your pressure as you get up to the top, because you don't have as much clay to move around. It takes more pressure at the bottom here. Okay, so got rid of that clay. I'm going to dribble some water on my clay. I'm going to squeeze a ridge. And then again, I'm going to lift that ridge up the side of the pot at a nice, regular, steady speed. When I get to the top, I'm going to ease my hands off the top. I don't want them to slip off the top, or the top gets all messed up, and it gets too thin as well. And then I'm going to straighten up that top edge again. And that's really all you're doing. You're squeezing a ridge, you're lifting that at a nice steady pace up the side of the pot until you get to the very top. Several things to point out. These are called throwing rings, which you can keep or not, whether you like them or not. But they're all about, ½ an inch apart, and that's a good sign that I'm moving my hands up the side of the pot at the right speed. The thing that complicates it is that it's a ratio between how wet or dry the clay is, and how hard you're pushing, and how fast your hands are going. If I push really hard and my hands don't go up very fast, I'm just going to push right through the pot. I'll just tear the top off. It'll happen. You know, you'll all do that, and it's fine. You have to do that to know what that feels like. You know, so you're gonna do that. And if I go too slowly, it'll just take forever, and the pot won't really go anywhere, and you won't really have any visible rings. So you want to find a good balance between the two. Also notice when I'm putting water on it, I make a little slippery side with my hand. I just run the water right down my fingers, and it goes right down the side of the pot, and then it doesn't go flying everywhere. Right? Brilliant. I know. It's brilliant. So,
did you invent that?
I'm sure I did. I must have invented that. I should patent it. The patented wind blower.
It's the wind method.
Slippery slide, yeah. So, same thing. I'm going to squeeze here. My hands are still braced, by the way. This pot is getting pretty tall. My hands can barely touch each other, but it's still easier than doing it without them touching. At some point, my hands are not going to be able to touch each other, and that just takes practice. But as long as they can, my hands are still going to touch, and my elbows are still going to be tucked in and braced somewhere. Again, if I'm making a really big pot, my hands are going to be out like this, but I'm not doing that right now. And this is much, much easier. So I'm pushing on it, lot of clay coming up. I'm talking too much. And when I get to the top, I'm going to let my hands catch up with each other, and then I'm going to ease my hands off the pot. When it gets really big, you might try, you can actually just throw, starting in the middle. Finish that up. And then go back to the bottom and do a fold. You don't have to do bottom to top every single time. So I do that sometimes, especially if the clay's a little wet. My left hand is above my right hand. My inside hand is above my outside hand all the time, which is really important. When it starts to flare out like that, and it'll do that because as the clay's spinning around and it just sort of, it's a physics principle. Centripetal force, is that it? I think it is. Anyway, the clay will start to flare out. So before it gets too flared, hang on, do it this way, I'm actually going to do something called collaring. I'm going to take my hands with a lot of water on the clay so it slides, and I'm just going to gently push it back in. If your clay is too wet, it's not going to want to do that. It'll really resist it, and this just started to, it'll actually want to fold on itself. It was showing signs of wanting to do that. But I can straighten it back up just by doing that, just by collaring it in. When I do that, the top edge is going to get uneven. It always does. It doesn't really like that very much. So this is how you get the top edge even again. This seems scary, but this is better than the alternative. So don't leave the top edge really uneven. It's going to cause more problems down the road. So if it's uneven on the top, you need to trim it off, and that's what this needle is for. I'm going to hold it, whether you're left or right-handed, I'm holding it in my right hand because I want to work on the right side of the clay, so the clay's flowing through it. And I'm going to hold it so that there's a little bit of the needle showing. My left hand is going to be on the inside, and my hands are going to be touching again. Anything you do, if your hands can touch each other, trimming, throwing, centering, whatever, you want to do that. I'm just going to lay it along the side, and very carefully and slowly, I'm just going to push it through until I feel it with my left hand. And once I feel it with my left hand, then I just lift that ring of clay up off the needle tool. Notice that I cut off, 3/8 of an inch or so. You can't cut off just a tiny little bit, or it'll just mess up your pot. And the thinner the walls are, the more delicate and more sensitive it is to that. But it wouldn't be a bad idea to just sit with a pot and maybe pare it down, a ring at a time, so you get used to doing that. Because it's a really handy thing to be able to do. So it's still a little thick. It's getting a little wet, so I don't know how much thinner I can get it. But I'm trying right now just to make this straight cylinder. Step B of this assignment will be to start curving it, but we're not going to do that yet. So I'm just going to see if I can make it a little bit thinner. The wetter it gets, the less easy that's going to be to do. If you put your hands on the clay right where I stopped, your left hand, your inside hand would be like that. It would be above your outside hand. Okay, so I might be able to make that a little bit thinner, but that's pretty good. So this is what you should do to finish your piece. Your first assignment is to make 10 cylinders as tall as you can get them. With 4 pounds of clay, you ought to be able to make one this tall, but that takes a little bit of practice. If you're not using 4 pounds of clay, 4 pounds is a lot. So start with 2 or 3 if this is too much. And work your way up to it. Don't think that they're a failure just because they're not that tall. I'm going to get the water out of the inside of the pot with my sponge. I'm going to straighten up the sides using this flexible scraper. And this does actually a couple things. It'll straighten the sides, it'll get rid of the throwing rings, and it actually compresses the clay. So if there's a lot of water in the clay, it'll actually squeeze some of it out of the clay. And that can be helpful if you want to keep throwing. So I'm just, right now, my finger is just like this on the inside wall. and I'm just pushing against it with that. So I'm straightening those walls up. I'm not trying to do it all at once, so it still leans inward just a little bit. Be really careful when you're getting the clay off of that. I know people cut themselves on this tool because it's sharp enough that if you slide your finger too quickly on it, you can actually cut yourself. But it's a handy little tool. I still use it. And I'm just pushing against that tool. So I get the walls nice and straight. The next thing I'm going to do is do something about the top edge. Just like in Ceramics 1, where I harped on the cut slab edge all the time. Same thing, you know. I've just trimmed this off with a trimming needle, and if I stop it, you know, that's not an edge you want to drink out of if it was a mug, or, you know, it's just, it looks really unfinished. So even, I mean, that's a perfectly fine thickness, but you might want to taper it just a little bit, and I do that by holding the wall with my left hand to support it, and then just polishing it with my sponge on my right hand. My hands again are touching as much as possible, so I'm just finishing that edge off so it's a little bit more appealing to look at. Again, if it's really uneven, trim it off first, and then do that final polishing. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I've got a little extra clay down here that I don't want. It's not that big a deal, but I can demonstrate how to do this. I'm going to get rid of a little bit of that clay with this tool. I'm cutting down. This tip is broken a little bit, but I'm cutting that clay away. And the other thing that does is make it ready for trimming if I want to do some trimming. Use this side. Also, the first thing you're going to do is learn to not throw in a bat. Some of these people are throwing on discs that are attached to the wheel head. When you start to throw more delicate things and bowls and stuff like that, you kind of need to do that. But I want you to learn how to take your pot off the wheel head as well. So I'm going to take the pointy tip of this, and I'm just going to dig it in to the bottom of the pot, underneath the pot, so that there's a little bit of an angle under there. I'll use this one. That one has a bad point on it. I want to use one with a really good point. And I'm digging in underneath it. If I go straight in, I'll get a stronger angle. If I don't want a really big obvious angle, then I go in a little flatter. And all that does is just get rid of some of that extra clay, and it's going to make it a lot easier to finish after I take it off the wheel head. Clean that up just a little bit. Something goofy going on here. So the more you can do while the pot is on the wheel, the better. You're going to be really tempted to, after you take it off the wheel, to kind of smooth it with your hands and get it straightened up. That's just going to get worse. It's just going to get really fingerprinty and messed up. So you want to do anything that you need to do to it. Like I've got a little bit of a messy thing up there. I want to do it while the pot is spinning around and it's on the wheel, because I'll never make it cleaner and neater than when it's spinning. All right, when I'm ready to get it off the wheel, I'm going to grab that. As much as possible, either use the rectangular wear boards or the wooden bats, or wear boards. Don't use the plastic bats. We've got a lot of people throwing in here. We're going to need those for the wheels. But I'm going to cut my pot off by taking the cutting wire and shortening it, and then holding it down on the wheel head with my thumbs to make sure that when I pull back, I don't also pull up. Then you're going to have an uneven bottom on your pot. You want it to be nice and flat. So I'm just going to pull straight back, and then make sure my hands are dry. If I have to, I go wash my hands off, dry them off, and then come back over. And then I can just pick the pot up and set it